at least 50% of the antibiotic prescriptions are unnecessary. They're given for things that the antibiotic won't help, like viral infections. They're starting to understand that giving antibiotics to people actually can do harm. They're now starting to realize that there's long-term consequences for taking that because they disrupt the microbiome so much. And when you disrupt the microbiome, you create risk for disease. When a patient comes in, especially if they're sick or they're coming in with their kid, and the kid is sick and the kid is miserable, has a high fever, is sniffly, is crying and all that, and you know, as a doctor, you look at them, you look at the signs, symptoms, you know that they're dealing with a virus infection, a cold or flu, whatever it may be, and what they really should be doing is going home and resting. You get a lot of pressure by the patient to write them a script. Medicine is an economical for-profit industry. You don't write them a script for something, they won't come back to your clinic. Even though you know it's not going to help their condition, in their mind, they've got medicine now. They should be better. And then they go fill the script, they take the antibiotic, they feel better in 3 or 4 days like they were going to anyway.
Welcome to the Your Body's Way podcast. I am so happy to have you on this episode. And talking about a really, really fascinating topic, which I know that you're incredibly well versed in. I know that you're on podcast after podcast talking about this, and your work is all about this topic. I can only imagine that your life is basically all about this topic at the moment. It can only be the case, right? Because it's so detailed, it's so fascinating, and you've climbed so high in your career in this department. So this is none other than the microbiome, and it's a fascinating topic, and I can't think of anyone better to talk about this with than yourself, because I have to admit, I've come across a lot of like presentations and podcasts about the microbiome, but I have to say, Kiran, I don't think anybody talks about this topic like you do. There's something about the way you talk about it that is so easy to understand for the layperson, and just so easily relatable. And I feel so motivated every time I listen to you talk about it. So a big welcome, Kiran. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. That was one of the nicest welcomes I've ever had. So thank you so much. I'm doing wonderful. I'm doing wonderful. I'm doing what I love from when it comes to work, family, and all that is okay and great. We're getting all our big winter coats out, ready for the impending cold that's coming here in Chicago. So no complaints at all. And I love the holiday season. To me, it's just such good vibes in general, and lots of time with family and friends and all that. So it's an exciting time of year for me, and I get to meet you, and I get to engage with you and do this conversation. So I have no complaints.
Amazing. And this is just going to be such a fascinating podcast, because what I noticed when I was researching you and what you do, you're a fantastic microbiologist, and you're doing all sorts of things in your career, which I'm happy for you to dive into in a moment. But I have to say, like, it's really great to see everything that you're doing, and I feel like you get a lot of positive feedback from what you do as well, from reading what people say about you. So do you find that a lot of people are responding well to what you do?
Yeah, that has actually been the propellant for what I do. So if you look at how we started in this world of the microbiome, so the company that I'm most known for is Microbiome Labs, which is a company that I co-founded in 2012. And like any other business, especially we were an unfunded business, we didn't have investors and all that. We grew it through grassroots means and real, just kind of hardcore business fundamentals. Like any business like that, you go through a lot of arduous times, right? And you're making sacrifices, you're taking risks with your family and things like that. You're also traveling extensively. I flew over the last 10 years on average 300,000 to 400,000 miles a year. I speak outside of the couple of years during the pandemic when there was like no meetings and events. But outside of that, I speak 45, 50 times in person each year all over the world. And then on top of that, I do at least 130, 140 online interviews like this, like podcasts and things like that. So you're putting so much into it, right? But the thing that really drives you, there's always an economic potential as well, which, to be honest about things, an important component of it. But the fuel that really drives you is when you get those messages from people that you've somehow changed their life, or you've saved or changed the life of somebody that they really care about. The one thing you said on this one interview, had a huge impact on them, and they made some changes because of that. And then you start to think about, like, what is your purpose here? Like, if I have information in my head and I'm not doing everything I can to share it, that may impact someone's life in a positive way, then am I really living up to my potential, right? And is that my purpose, right? If I have an innate understanding of certain thing that can really be helpful to someone else, then it becomes my purpose to share it. I don't find myself, at least I don't think so, and I think people have said this to me, but I don't find myself developing any sort of ego from it. From the accolades that I do get, I literally use it as fuel to wake up every day and do the work and do the research and travel and leave your family and be gone for a couple of weeks all around the world speaking and all that. It's the fuel that I need to do that with. So I absolutely appreciate people when they do reach out and they say nice things and they talk about how you've impacted them. And not everybody needs to do that. And not everyone does it, certainly, but I really appreciate when people do. I never take it for granted. And I never let it make me feel cooler than I am, because at the end of the day, I know I'm just a regular dude and kind of a dork to begin with. But I just happen to understand a certain thing that can help people. So it's a wonderful position to be in if you can kind of tap into that.
And I love that. And I have to say, whoever's listening and this audience, they are so, so lucky, because they're about to get a serious breakdown of the gut microbiome and how not only fascinating it is and blah, 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 like how amazing it is, but also how important it is to our health and to every single thing about our personalities, our how healthy we are, and our motivations, and the bacteria are behind all of it. And that's what, literally, I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. So first of all, just so that people can get a real kind of grasp of who you are. So what led you to become a microbiologist? What's your journey?
Yeah. So I've always been a science nerd, right? So there's a couple of things within my constitution that have driven me to the sciences. Number one, my parents absolutely had an influence on that. My mom's a medical doctor, and my dad was a microelectronics engineer. So I had actually a little bit of the two halves, right? So my mom's on the clinical biological science side of things, the helping people and the empathy side of science. My dad, being an engineer, and to that extent, the microelectronics engineer, he was a very innovative guy. I mean, he has over 200 US patents in his name. He's invented a lot of stuff that's in our electronics that we use on a day-to-day basis. So he had that kind of out-of-the-box innovation type of thinking. And I think I developed a little bit of both of them in the way I function. I'm a biologically minded individual with a clinical lean towards what I do. I always think of myself as being empathetic towards people's suffering and health suffering. And I feel like innovation drives me right in that space. So I think that was a background. Now, the other thing in my constitution is that I'm almost obsessively curious about things. And I have to understand things around me. It's really hard for me to just take things for granted for how they work or how they function, right? I'll give you an example of that. I grew up in India and Malaysia. So I grew up in a very different environment than most other people in the Western world did. But when I first moved to the US when I was 14, that was the first time I saw this thing called a microwave, right? But everyone I know and all my friends used it, and they would just open the door and put food in and push a button, and 30 seconds later, it's piping hot. And I was always like, how does this work? Like what is happening to the food? How is it getting hot so fast? There's no fire, there's no heat that I can see. And nobody knew or nobody cared that I'd ask. Who cares? Just put it in. This is how you work it. But that's the kind of thing that bothers me. Like I need to know how this works. So I need to go and study at the time in the library, because we didn't have the internet, microwave radiation. How does that work? Right. So I'm the kind of kid that would have to figure that out, and educate myself on it. And so because of that, I always had a real drive to understand the world around me. So science was a natural fit, because science helps explain how the world around you works. And then I chose microbiology, and this is a less interesting or intelligent reason, but from a movie. I've always been very curious about the unknown. So I was very much into quantum physics as well, right? Because quantum physics is just this beautiful, mysterious thing that we all know affects all of us. It created the universe and everything. We use it on a day-to-day basis, but most people don't really understand it. And there's so much of it we still don't know and understand. There's lots to discover, right? So that's that innovation part of me that's like, I want to be in a place where there's lots of things to discover. The microbiology, when I learned about it, was a biological version of that, because the world of microbes is an unseen world, right? We don't see it. We interact with it every single day. It influences almost everything that occurs to us and will occur to us. It influences where we are and how we are where we are in our lives, and we can't see it, right? And then there's so much to discover in that side of it. So for that reason, I went towards the microbiology side, and in particular because I saw a movie the second day I started university, and the movie was called Outbreak, which is a old movie with Morgan Freeman and Dustin Hoffman, where there was a viral outbreak in a town, and these CDC, microbiologists and virologists were chasing down this disease to try to figure out what the cause of it was and what the cure could be. That looked really exciting to me, and I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to learn about microbes and disease and chase microbes and find cures. And so that's why I picked microbiology, because it fit like all the boxes for me.
I love that. What a great story. That movie inspired your career choice. I absolutely love that. So, I mean, Kiran, this is the part where you really get the audience excited. I know this just from looking at everything you've done in the past. So when it comes to the microbiome, so we've all heard of it. It's now this kind of term that we got to kind of understand. But we don't really understand it in the way that we really should. So I noticed that on your website, you said that we're in the era of the microbiome, which is really interesting. And that kind of gives me the impression that we're becoming more and more aware of what the microbiome is and how important it is. So Kiran, this is your time to shine. What is the microbiome? Why are we in the era of the microbiome? And why is it so important for us to learn about it? What is it?
Yeah. So let me give you first a scientific definition of it, and then let's unpack what that actually means, right? So the microbiome is defined as the totality of organisms, microorganisms, and their genetic elements as it relates to a host, right? So, and we happen to be the host. When we say the totality of microorganisms, so we mean things like bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa, and so on. So there's lots of different microbes. Now, in the human system, the majority of microbes are bacteria, but there's lots of viruses, there's lots of fungi, and there's lots of other things as well. But often it becomes easier from a contextual perspective to talk about the bacteria, right? Because that influences things the most. So let's unpack what that definition means, right? What we realized only recently is that virtually every part of our body is covered with an ecosystem, and the ecosystem is unique depending on the part of the body that it is. And in fact, the ecosystem dictates how that part of the body functions, right? And this is the part that really dismantles old ideas around biology in the system. So number one, let's look at our genetics, right? So for the longest time, we thought our genes dictated almost everything, right? How we function, what we metabolize, what we're sensitive to, like how our body responded to disease, whether or not we got a disease was based on our genes. Now, think about this for a moment. We are wholly inadequate in our own genetics, right? And the reason for that is because we have 22,000 functional genes as a human being, as the top of the evolutionary ladder, as the top of the food chain, right? Humans are by leaps and bounds far more sophisticated than any other animal on this earth, or any animal that has ever lived on this earth, right? We have 22,000 functional genes. An earthworm has 30,000 functional genes, right? An earthworm that we would scoff at as being really primitive and just a stupid earthworm, burrowing in the dirt, has actually more genetic capability than we do. Then the question becomes, well, how is it that we are so sophisticated, right? We have over 1.5 to 2 million microbial genes in our system. And their genetics is what offers us most of our capabilities, right? So if you take two humans, for example, you and I, we are physically very different, right? No one would ever mistake you for me or me for you, right? And we're personality-wise and all that, I'm sure we're different to a certain degree as well. But genetically, we are 99.9% identical. Right? All the differences we can see on this program between you and I, you are a beautiful lady, I'm a dude, right? And we sound different, we look different, our shapes are different and all that, right? All of that, everything that we can physically see as a difference is accounted for in that 0.1%, right? We're 99.9% identical, you and I, right? Yeah, our microbiomes can be as little as 10% similar. We can be almost 90% different in our microbiome. And that's what really affords us our uniqueness. Mm-hmm. That's what affords us our capabilities, right? And so the reason why medicine is moving toward this individualistic model, this customized model, and we know that the same pill doesn't work for everybody. We know in almost every clinical trial, even 35% effectiveness rate is a good trial, because nothing's going to work for 100% of people, right? You can give two people the same diet, they'll have completely different outcomes. People experience things very differently. Everything is different. People are individuals. All of that individuality comes from the microbes in your system, not from that 1.1% genetic difference that we have, right? Now, let's expand that even further, which is really interesting. If you think about it, our closest mammalian relative are the chimpanzees, right? The descendants of the great apes. We are 99% similar to chimpanzees. We're 99.9% similar to each other from genetic material. Genetic material-wise, we are 99% identical to chimpanzees. All the differences we see between us and chimpanzees physically is accounted for by 1% of our genes, right? And yet we are vastly different from our closest mammalian ancestors from a genetic perspective in our microbiomes. Our microbiomes are completely different from chimpanzees. In fact, our microbiomes in the world of apes is closest to baboons. And that's because of baboons' behavior compared to our behavior. Baboons became nomadic, living in tribes, coming down from the trees, walking for long distances on the earth, digging for roots and tubers. Baboons developed incisors to be able to hunt. As much as they ate vegetation, they killed animals and ate them as well. They ate insects, roots, tubers. They had a very diverse diet. They had behaviors similar to Homo sapiens, which is us, their distant cousins. And so we developed a microbiome that's similar to theirs, even though we're genetically not as close to them as we are to chimpanzees, right? And so our evolution and our behaviors and our progress in the biological world is dictated more by the behaviors we did, and then thereby the microbes that we picked up to create this microbiome, right? And so know that over 90% of all the things that are happening in your body every single minute of every single day are more dictated by the microbes in our own genetics, right? Over 90%, which means that only until recently have we started looking at the vast majority of human functionality, right? All of the clinical and scientific research up to about 2010. So all the hundreds of years before that, we're looking at just 10% of the human. We're finally opening up the other 90%, right? And so we're finally starting to understand how we function, what drives us, what creates disease, what creates risk, what helps cure us, and everything about the human condition. We're finally starting to tap into it. And so it provides us with the biggest opportunity to mitigate disease, because we now know that the vast majority of disease that people deal with are due to an ecological disruption in their body, right? Not a genetic risk. In the early 90s, the assumption was that for every disease we were dealing with, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, each one had a gene. And the gene would be mutated, and that would be the thing that caused your disease. This is why they kicked off the Human Genome Project, right? To look for to sequence the entire human genome, figure out what every gene does, and then through that search, we would find the disease genes, and we would understand the proteins that they create, and then maybe there's a way of mitigating those proteins, right? So that was the model. Then they sequence the whole human genome, and they go, oh, crap, this doesn't tell us anything, because they estimated that we would have at least 250,000 genes because we're so complex. We have 22,000 genes, right? So then it created this vast vacuum of information that goes, how do we do what we do? How do we function as a human? We don't have the codes or the capability to do that. That's when they kicked off the Human Microbiome Project to understand the impact of the microbes in our system, right? So without the microbes, we would cease to exist. And most of our existence is going to be dictated by the microbes that we have in our system. Most of our organs function the way they're supposed to function because of the microbes in the system. If you change the microbes on that particular organ or in that organ, you will change how that organ functions, right? The skin is a perfect example of that. The gut is a perfect example of that. The moment you shift the microbes in those systems, the organ itself cannot function the way it's supposed to. The microbes dictate the function of our system.
So can I just, sorry, can I just clarify then? Because this is absolutely blowing my mind as you're talking. I'm just like nodding along and I'm just taking it all in. But so are you basically saying that our genes have less to do with how we express ourselves? Like, for example, you know, what our health is and, you know, how our body expresses ourselves, our personalities, our organs. It's less to do with genes and more to do with the microbes. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right.
That is insane.
Yeah, it's completely insane when you think about it, right? Because we've understood for a while that people are very unique, right?
Because of the microbes, right?
But so for the longest time, we thought that, well, it's all genetic variation, right? That you know, somebody from Cambodia is going to be genetically quite a bit different than somebody from Norway, right? You look at them and they physically look very different. The foods they eat are very different. Their resilience to certain things are very different. You take that Cambodian person and put them in Norway, they're going to have some issues. Same as you take the Norwegian person and put them in Cambodia, they're probably going to get sick for a while, right? Some of those things were all thought to be based on the variation in genetics. But then as the world of genetics became more and more sophisticated, we start to go, wait, we're all 0.1% different or less. So our genes are almost identical, right? So why is it that we have such a huge diversity of people and such a huge diversity of functionality and such a huge diversity in terms of response to things, right? You and I could eat the same thing and have completely different response to it, right? All of that is based on the microbes, the ecosystem. The microbes provide us with function. Our genes provide us with structure.
Okay.
Right. So we just break it down. And then, of course, there's nuance there. I don't want to oversimplify it, but just so people understand it, right? Our genes provide us the structure, but the microbes provide the function within the structure, right? And that's a really important thing to think about, because it's very rare that there's a structural problem, right? Of course, some people are born with disabilities and dysfunctions. There are some congenital defects that occur in the human system that will be a disease driver, but that's actually quite rare compared to the lifestyle and chronic disease that the vast majority of people suffer from, right? So when you think about cancer, heart disease, diabetes, dementia, autoimmune conditions, these things account for 99% of the disease-related deaths in the world, right? All of those are driven by your ecosystem, not your genes. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's mind-boggling to think that the little bacteria have such a massive influence on us. And we always kind of looked at microbes as being primitive, right? We always looked at microbes as being these tiny little single cell organisms. What can they do? Well, we know that they're very profound, right? We've had microbes that have almost wiped out 80% of the earth, right? You think about the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, and so on, or even recently with COVID, a single virus, which is not even a living thing, or bacteria, can take out all the humans, right? And that's how powerful they are, and how much they can affect our system. So if you can think about one bacteria that can wipe out 75% of life in Europe during the bubonic plague, right? One bacteria can have a huge influence in a positive way to the other end of that spectrum, right? And we see this constantly in microbiome research.
Yeah. Wow. So fascinating. And is it okay if today we talk about specifically weight loss, weight gain, metabolism?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
this podcast, I mean, a lot of my listeners, they like to train, they like to eat well, they like to look and feel their best. So I was hoping to kind of now change the perspective and to focus more on that.
Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to just say, because obviously if someone is struggling to lose weight, like no matter what they do, which is something that is so common these days, it's most likely there's an imbalance in the bacteria somewhere in the gut microbiome.
Yeah.
And I love how I heard you say it once that having because our bacteria are so prevalent in us, and they rule, and they're the majority of our function. Having an imbalanced microbiome compromises your ability to be a human. And so when you have an imbalanced microbiome, to an extent, you're actually becoming less and less human. Like the more off kilter it goes, the less of a person you become, which is absolutely fascinating. So how does the microbiome affect our weight?
Yeah. This is a really, really significant area of research and science, because obviously weight, obesity, metabolic disease is a big driver of chronic disease, right? So you have the whole condition of metabolic syndrome, which has lots of chronic conditions under it. I wrote a paper when I first got into the microbiome world. And this was just a white paper. It wasn't a published paper. It was really for the industry itself. And I titled it Metabolic Reprogramming, right? And what that meant was that no matter what you ate, there's a way of reprogramming your ecosystem so that your body responds completely differently to foods. Right. And the signs and signals for this for me came from a couple of different areas. Number one, we all know that person that can basically seem like they can eat whatever they want and they never gain weight. Right. We always used to say they have a high metabolism as a way of explaining it. But they don't have to actively make food choices, and they just kind of eat whatever they want and they're fine. They're always lean. Then we also know the person that can be very careful about what they eat and watching things all the time, and they still struggle to both lose weight and not gain weight, right? And so just looking at those two types of individuals, then when you dig into the science, you find that there's all this amazing research on what's called discordant twins, right? So these are identical twins, which means they have identical genomes, right? So there's nothing physically different about them. They were raised in the exact same household, fed the same things, and yet one of the twins is obese and the other one's lean, right? So there's no behavior issue that's different. There's no genetic issue that's different. Why is it that one of the twins is obese and the other one's lean? So what they've done in terms of these discordant twin studies is they've taken a group of mice that are genetically identical. These are called nobiotic mice. So these are mice that are raised without a microbiome, right? So they have all the capabilities and function of a mouse, but they don't have a microbiome. They're raised in a sterile environment. They've given lots of antibiotics and so on to basically sterilize them. And then you can implant microbiomes into these mice to see how it affects the mouse, right? So what they've done is they take groups of genetically identical mice. They take the microbiome from the obese twin and put it in half the group, take the microbiome from the lean twin and put it in the other half of the group, and then they feed both groups of mice, the exact same diet, right? Same timing, same number of calories, same volume. And at the end of a few weeks, the obese microbiome mice always gain weight and become obese, and the lean one always stays lean, right? So it didn't matter what they fed them. It didn't matter when they fed them. As long as the obese individual's microbiome is in these mice, they will gain weight, right? And so now what's interesting is they've been able to do crossovers too, where then they re-sterilize those mice, right? So they obliterate the microbiome, they do a bunch of antibiotics, and then they switch the microbiome. So you've got overweight mice that now have the microbiome obliterated. They take the lean twins microbiome, put it in the overweight mice. They take the overweight twins microbiome, put it in the lean mice. Again, they continue feeding them the same diet, and their bodies shift. The obese mice lose all the weight, become lean. The lean mice gain weight, right? So there have been dozens of studies like this. And they've done it with humans as well as animals. And so it starts to speak to some other driving factor in the microbiome. Now, there's other components to this as well when it comes to humans, is that there are people that have addictions to food from trauma, right? And food can stoke dopamine release. So it's a dopaminergic substance. So they may be obsessively eating for that reason. And so they're taking in too many calories and just putting on weight. But at the end of the day, the way your body responds to food is largely dictated by your microbiome. There are certain features within a lean person's microbiome and an obese person's microbiome. And that paper I had mentioned early on was this idea that if we just shift the microbiome, even if we don't change their eating habits or their exercise, we shift their microbiome, we should be able to get them to lose weight, right? Without them trying. That was the premise of the paper. And then it took me like 8 years to be able to gain funding or have money to be able to do this study. So I actually have done that study. I'll tell you what happened. It's been published as well. And so basically at the end of the day, here's how the microbiome controls metabolism. So number one, the movement of food through the digestive tract, the peristalsis of the food, is dictated largely by the microbes in your system. If you have a dysfunctional microbiome, your peristaltic activity is going to be slowed down, right? So this is why a lot of times people will eat, they'll feel full for a long time, they'll get bloated and so on. All of those things are affected by the peristaltic activity of the food moving. Now, the longer the food sits in the small bowel, the more calories you're going to derive from the food, right? So this is called energy harvesting. So individuals that are overweight and have a dysfunctional microbiome, they tend to harvest a higher number of calories from every meal, right? So you can feed two people the same thing. One person who has a pro-obese microbiome may get 200 to 300 more calories out of that meal than somebody that has a lean microbiome that has a good pace moving digestive system, right? So that makes a difference, right? Because if you think about 10 meals where you're extracting 200 additional calories from each meal, 10 meals is basically 2.5 days, right? Now you're at 2,000 plus calories. That's almost a pound of fat, right? So you can feed the two individuals the same thing over a 2-3 day period. This individual may gain a pound of fat from the same food that this individual doesn't, because they're not harvesting the same number of calories, right? So that's one view of it. The second thing that occurs is the satiety signaling, right? So one of the things that's supposed to happen if you have a healthy microbiome is you're supposed to get signals from the gut after you eat that go to the brain that tell the brain to stop releasing hunger hormones, ghrelin. Right? When you're hungry and you haven't eaten, your brain releases ghrelin that motivate you to go eat. That's the gurgling and the pangs and all that you feel in the gut, right? So when you start eating and you get adequate amount of calories or volume of food, ghrelin levels are supposed to drop dramatically, right? But that's a signal that comes from the gut. If your gut is dysfunctional, your gut's not talking to the brain. There's something lost in the vagus nerve in that signaling. And so your brain keeps producing hunger hormones. even though you've consumed a couple thousand calories already. So this then drives those individuals to overeat, right? So they eat beyond the area of satiety. So those satiety signals aren't getting to them. Now, the other problem with not getting satiety signals is that not only does the satiety signal help you stop eating when you're satiated and full, right? Or you shouldn't even get full, you should be just satiated and stop there. It also triggers your metabolic process, right? So ghrelin, which is a hunger hormone, is supposed to come down. At the same time, leptin is supposed to go up, right? Leptin kicks off your metabolism. It tells all the cells in your body to start burning fat for fuel, bringing in, releasing insulin, controlling the blood sugar levels, bringing in blood sugar, either metabolizing it or storing it aside. But then it also stimulates something called AMPK, which causes a lot of your cells to start burning fat for fuel over the next several hours, right? So you kick off your metabolic process, and you feel that satiation, so you stop eating, right? Leptin resistance is one of the foundational aspects of weight gain and metabolic distress, is where the function of leptin isn't occurring, just like insulin resistance. Your body can't release enough leptin because your hunger hormone levels are still high, and your body's trying to release leptin, but you're not responding to the leptin. Right? Then you've got another satiety-based compound, metabolic compound called adiponectin, that's also supposed to be released when leptin goes up. That doesn't occur in individuals that continue to maintain a high level of ghrelin. In our first study that we published in 2017 on leaky gut, right, we tested this and we saw the difference, right? These weren't overweight individuals yet, because they were relatively young still. They were 23, 24 years old. They were of normal body weight, but they had severe leaky gut, which means that their microbiome is dysfunctional, their gut and the brain aren't talking, and so on, right? So we had these individuals come in to the lab when they're fasted. We tested their ghrelin levels. We saw ghrelin levels are very high, of course, because they're fasted. So their body's saying, hey, you got to eat. We give them a 2,000 calorie meal, which should be enough for almost anybody in a single meal. And then we measure them 3, 4, 5 hours later, and the ghrelin levels have barely dropped. They're still producing hunger hormones, and leptin levels are barely increasing, right? So these individuals, even though they're 23 and their body composition is okay for now, they are on the road to developing obesity. And it was 50% of the students that we tested. Right? 50% of the students that we tested had this confirmation, where they didn't have any proper leptin and adiponectin response, and ghrelin did not respond after a meal. So they had no satiation when they're supposed to, and they're not kicking off their metabolic response either, and they're not controlling the blood sugar well because of it, the postprandial blood sugar. So their blood sugar tends to be higher postprandially, right? So years of that programs your metabolic system to be obese. Right? At the same time, because your microbiome is disrupted, your gut is leaky, you're also not producing enough short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which manage your metabolic process and increase fat burning, and also improve satiety, and binds to these receptors called GLP-1. A lot of people are hearing about this because you've got Ozempic, semaglutide, these peptides, these weight loss drugs that are agonists for GLP-1. They affect those receptors. Butyrate, that's produced by your microbiome, does the same exact thing. So these peptides are mimicking what a naturally healthy microbiome should be doing. This is why people lose weight pretty quickly on those things. Of course, they have side effects for them. It's probably better to do it through modulating the microbiome, but the drugs kind of mimic the same pathology, right? And so based on all of this understanding, and then the other thing is that there are certain microbes that produce things like CLA, like conjugated linoleic acid. A lot of people may take that as a supplement to increase fat burn and improve metabolic response, but you have microbes in your gut that produce that as well. So you're harvesting more calories from every meal. You naturally eat more volume because you don't have the right satiety signals. You can't burn calories at the same effective rate after the meal. Your blood sugar tends to be higher after the meal. Your satiety, your metabolic response through leptin and adiponectin isn't effectively working. That is the recipe for obesity, right? And this is why you can feed two individuals the same meal and one will consistently gain weight, the other stays lean. If you have a healthy microbiome, what tends to happen is you stop eating sooner because you feel satiated, right? I see this in my kids, for example, right? They're young, they're healthy, they're vibrant, and even the foods that they really love, make it like pancakes with syrup. The moment they're satiated, they're done with it, right? They push it aside, right? It doesn't matter how much of a treat it is. They never overeat, right? My kid, in fact, our own programming dysfunction in our heads will see how much they ate and we think they haven't eaten enough, right? We go, wait, you should finish your food. Well, I'm not hungry anymore, but you haven't eaten enough, but I'm not hungry, right? We're like battling against their biological signals because we've been programmed for decades to think that we have to finish our plate, we have to finish everything. There's a certain volume of food that you have to eat, but you see that in kids where the metabolic system is working perfect still. The moment they are satiated, they're done with it. The food is actually, they don't even care about it, Then they want to just go off and play, right? They have energy, they're bouncing around, their metabolic system is kicked in. They want to go burn off energy. And so we see how that's supposed to work. So going back to my paper that I wrote, Metabolic Reprogramming, the study we were able to do is we took a group of overweight individuals. These are just shy of being clinically obese, so their BMIs were 30, right? And they had bad eating patterns, no exercise, right? It just kind of, that's their lifestyle. And we took these individuals and we said, okay, we're going to split them into a placebo and a treatment group. No dietary changes. Don't add in any exercise or activity. But here, you take these 2 capsules, you take these 2 capsules, right? Placebo controlled. The capsules we gave them was a probiotic and a prebiotic. And the probiotic that I knew shifts their microbiome, and the prebiotic enhances the production of short-chain fatty acids. At the end of a 12-week period, with no change in diet or exercise, the individuals on the probiotic and prebiotic had a 35% reduction in visceral fat mass. 35%, right? And about an 8% increase in lean muscle. And they weren't working out. Right? They had all these other metabolic markers improving, like C-peptide, which indicates glucose control in the body, right? Inflammatory markers, metabolic markers. We did an RNA blast where we looked at over 200 different RNA expressions that are associated with metabolic health. 25 of those showed significant change to show that metabolically, at a cellular level, they were metabolically healthier, despite no diet, no exercise, right? Now, I would never advocate no diet, no exercise, but we had to do that to control for that part of it, just to see if just shifting the microbiome created this difference. And it absolutely does, right?
Was that a regular prebiotic, probiotic, like something that people could just buy off the shelf, or?
Yeah, we used a spore probiotic that I developed called Megaspore. So we use a Megaspore probiotic, and we use oligosaccharide prebiotic. It's called xylo-oligosaccharide, and it's very bifidogenic, meaning it increases the growth of bifidobacterium. Studies do show that individuals with high levels of bifidobacterium tend to be leaner, right? And we also know that it stokes a lot of short-chain fatty acid production. So high production of butyrate, for example, when you consume this prebiotic. Now, when you add the probiotic and prebiotic, you get short-chain fatty acids increasing by 150%, right? So we knew this would be a significant increase in short-chain fatty acids, which their systems don't normally get because they don't eat a lot of fiber. They're just eating, highly processed, terrible food. And so we knew that in itself will be a significant change in their system. We've also been able to show that the spores increase diversity in the microbiome, and the spores increase the growth of keystone species, which are associated with leanness, like Akkermansia, right? So I knew that from other studies we were able to do before this, that we were going to be shifting the microbiome in a pro-lean manner. What I didn't know is, would that actually translate to weight loss, right? Because one of the questions becomes is that when you look at a lean individual's microbiome versus an obese individual's, the question is the lean individual's microbiome that way because of their choices and their behaviors, right? The foods they eat, the exercise and things like that, assuming that's what they do. Or the obese individuals, does their microbiome look like that because of their choices? Or are they lean and obese because their microbiomes are like that, right? It's a chicken and egg story. So that was one of the things I set out to try to answer. And the data indicated that it was the microbiome that really originates it. Now, this was supported by studies published by the American Diabetic Association, right? Much more sophisticated researchers than I am. And they showed that type 2 diabetes and obesity is initiated by a dysfunctional microbiome that leads to leaky gut and other chronic low-grade inflammation issues, right? So the dysfunction in the microbiome comes first before you gain weight, before you have prediabetes, before you have diabetes, and so on.
Oh, that's juicy. That's really, really juicy. So let's backtrack, right? So we're all born, presumably, most of us, with a perfectly balanced microbiome. So our functions are healthy and we're doing great. But then as time goes on, as life kind of gets real and, things happen to us, we get up to certain things, our somehow our guts become compromised, the microbiome. And you've mentioned leaky gut a few times. And so basically, at some point, leaky gut becomes an issue, which then is the precursor to all of these problems, like being overweight, not being able to lose weight, and then disease, diabetes, and so on. So I guess what I want to naturally focus on now is that point. Like, what happens at that point when you're fine and all of a sudden you're predisposed to disease? What is that leaky gut? What happens? And just what happened to us? What's going on? Yeah.
Well, and one of the things I want to mention is there are a lot of people that are born with a dysfunctional microbiome to begin with, right? And that's because we get our microbiomes largely from mom and dad to a certain degree when we're born. So if mom's microbiome is dysfunctional, she's passing on a dysfunctional microbiome to the child. And then on top of that, if you're born through C-section and not through vaginal birth, you're already getting the wrong inoculum early on. So this is why studies show that babies born of C-section have a higher risk of allergies, asthma, obesity, diabetes, and all these other conditions, because they start off with a dysfunctional microbiome, right? Now, the good news is if you do start off with a dysfunctional microbiome, you can always make an improvement in your microbiome because it is an ecosystem. So it's not set in stone forever. You can positively change it. But you're right that in most cases, there's a change that happens at some point in your life where your gut starts to become leaky. I think it's a progression of things that will lead to a definitive shift in your microbiome, right? So let's talk about some of the things that drive the progression. Number one, antibiotic overuse, right? So we've all had multiple courses of antibiotics starting at a relatively early age, right? So many people start with antibiotics when they're 2 or 3 years old for what seems like an ear infection or a strep throat or something like that. And when you talk to enough doctors, and even the CDC mentioned this, that at least 50% of the antibiotic prescriptions are unnecessary. They're given for things that the antibiotic won't help, like viral infections, right? And then when you talk to doctors and you go, we were working with a big urgent care group, actually here in Chicago, and trying to create some products for them. And they wanted to create something that'll help the immune system. And I said, hey, you're a conventional doctor. It's interesting that you're thinking about supplements for the immune system. What's the motivation? And what he said is that they're starting to understand that giving antibiotics to people actually can do harm, right? Keep in mind that up to just a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, medical doctors would think that antibiotics are perfectly safe, right? They don't have a toxicity to themselves. You could take the full course and be fine normally. You might get some GI side effects, but they're now starting to realize that there's long-term consequences for taking that because they disrupt the microbiome so much. And when you disrupt the microbiome, you create risk for disease, right? And so they realize this and they go, we want to figure out an alternative to antibiotics. And I go, well, why are you writing so many antibiotics to begin with? And the response was, when a patient comes in, especially if they're sick or they're coming in with their kid, and the kid is sick and the kid is miserable, has a high fever, sniffly, is crying and all that, and as a doctor, you look at them, you look at the signs, symptoms, you know that they're dealing with a virus infection, a cold or flu, whatever it may be, and what they really should be doing is going home and resting and just taking the fluids and so on. You get a lot of pressure by the patient to write them a script. Why is that? Well, at least in the US, medicine is an economical for-profit industry, right? And so what he said poignantly, which was great that he was being very honest about it, is if you don't write them a script for something, they won't come back to your clinic. They'll go to the clinic down the street that will likely write them a script for something. Even though you know it's not going to help their condition, in their mind, they've got medicine now. They should be better. And then they go fill the script, they take the antibiotic, they feel better in 3 or 4 days like they were going to anyway, and then they just stop the antibiotic, right? It's a 10-day course, but they just stop it in 3 or 4 days. And now you're developing resistance to drug-resistant strains and all that stuff, taking an antibiotic you didn't need in the beginning, right? So there's lots of those kind of things that occur to people, and it disrupts your microbiome, incrementally over time. We're also constantly exposed to things like pesticides and herbicides and preservatives in foods and things like that. We eat a low diversity of foods. We eat a lot of processed foods, which means it shrinks the diversity of our microbiome. So incrementally, we're continuously disrupting our microbiome till it gets to a point where there's a definitive switch in the balance between microbes that eat away at the lining of the gut versus microbes that rebuild it, right? So there's a very important structural element in the lining of your intestines, and that's called a mucosal layer. It's actually a thick layer of mucus, if you will. Most of the microbes that live in your gut live in the top layer of this mucus, and then your intestinal cells are at the bottom layer of the mucus. And this mucus layer is very important because it's a physical barrier to things entering through your digestive tract that shouldn't be entering, right? It slows down the movement of things so your immune system and your cells can respond appropriately to the thing that's coming in. If it's a thing that shouldn't be coming in, there's time for your immune system to respond to it and neutralize it. Or if a thing that should be coming in, there's time for your cells on your intestines to open up and allow that thing through, the food, the nutrient, whatever it may be, right? So that mucosal layer is absolutely critical. Now, the mucosal layer also is devoid of microorganisms. As I mentioned, most of your microbes live in the top layer of it, and then there's a sterile component to it, and then your intestinal cells, right? That sterile layer provides a zone of comfort between your immune cells and your microbes that are up here, right? Because keep in mind, you've got trillions of microbes sitting up here. You've only got a single cell thick barrier that separates these trillions of microbes from your blood system. So your body is constantly nervous about sepsis or bacteremia. If something happens to this barrier, you could have trillions of bacteria falling into your blood supply, and now you've got bacteremia sepsis, which you're going to die from, right? Or the likelihood of dying from it is actually at least really high. And through the course of evolution, imagine our ancestors in caves and whatnot. If they had bacteremia, they're dead in 48 hours. They're not going to reproduce. Their structural elements are not going to propagate through the population, right? So the ones that ended up having a very thick mucosa that provides a geographic separation and provides a barrier to septicemia, those are the ones that survive. And then those people actually have microbes in their microbiome that maintain that structure, right? There are microbes like Akkermansia, Fecalum bacteria, Rumnococcus. All of these microbes, the way they benefit the host is by maintaining the integrity of that mucosal structure, right? Now, you've got lots of microbes in there that want to eat away at the mucosal structure. The mucus is a very good bacterial food. It's proteins and sugar bound together. So you've got microbes that constantly want to eat at it, but then you have these microbes that rebuild it constantly as well, right? So you've got a nice balance of decimation of the mucosal structure and rebuilding of it. Your mucosa, if you're a healthy individual, can turn over every 72 hours. You could have a completely new mucosal structure, right? That's how effective that balance is. Now, imagine through this incremental course of antibiotic exposure, poor dietary choices, exposure to pesticides, herbicides, stress, all of these things that we know are harmful to our microbiome, you start to get this imbalance where you have more microbes that eat the mucosal layer versus microbes that rebuild it, and so on and so on and so on. You get to a tipping point where now you're diminishing the structure of the mucosal layer more than you can rebuild it. And when you diminish it enough, now your gut is leaky. You don't have that barrier structure anymore, right? That becomes the definitive point where someone starts to move towards chronic disease from just simple digestive stuff, right? And it depends on what section of your gut. Like we all know we've got something like 22, 23 feet of digestive tract in our system. You could have this leakiness, this diminished mucosa in 6 inches of your bowel, and it's fine. You'll probably be asymptomatic. There's not a lot of issue. But if you have it in 6 feet of your bowel, now you've got a very prominent source of leakiness that drives chronic inflammation. Because the moment those things start to leak through, the trillions of bacteria become too close to the lining of your cells freak out and they recruit immune cells there constantly, and the immune cells are constantly eliciting an inflammatory response. Then that inflammatory response becomes systemic inflammation. Now you are at significant risk for chronic disease, because the vast majority of chronic diseases start with chronic low-grade systemic inflammation.
And I've just had, that makes plenty of sense. And I've just had like a bit of a kind of moment where I'm like, wow, I didn't realize that I always thought that leaky gut, if you have a leaky gut, then it's just all over your gut. But you just made it really obvious. And of course, that's not always the case. You might just have it in a small space. And if you have the leaky gut in just a small area, then it's not as a big deal than if it's over a larger space. And then the person who has it over a larger space is going to have a lot more health issues than the person who has a smaller space, which is really, really interesting. That is like mind blown. But
so this is why you can be subclinically leaky for years, right? In our first leaky
right?
gut
Do you think it spreads? Yeah.
Yep. In our first leaky gut study that we did, the individuals, and this was back to the leptin, adiponectin individuals that we tested, they had profound leakiness in the gut, but it was probably just for a small section of the gut. We could measure it. It was there. It was present, but they didn't have any clinical symptoms from it, right? But as that leakiness progresses to more and more of their intestinal tract, they will develop autoimmune disease, metabolic disease, all kinds of things down the road, right? Anxiety, depression, all of that comes with significant leaky gut. But theirs started off as a small section that you could measure, but wasn't clinically relevant because it wasn't enough to create symptomology yet.
So that's a kind of sign to anybody listening who, even if you don't have symptoms, to still look after yourself, still look after your gut, because you might have the beginnings of it, but you can't actually feel it. You don't have the symptoms yet, which is so, so interesting. So anybody who has difficulty losing weight, is obese, the likelihood is that they have leaky gut. Is that right?
They have profound leaky gut.
They have profound leaky gut.
Yeah.
I mean, so the next natural question is, how do we fix it? Can we fix it quickly? Is it a slow process? How do we do it?
Yeah, and I just want to make one more connection for people so they really understand this, right? So we've all known for a long time that if you have weight issues, it dramatically increases your risk for other disease conditions, right? If you're overweight, it dramatically increases your risk for heart disease, for diabetes, for dementia, for cancers. All of these other chronic diseases are doubled or quadrupled based on being overweight. Right? We've known that for a while. The epidemiological data is very clear on this. What we haven't known is why, right? Why is it carrying extra weight on your body, right? Creates all of this significant disease risk. Well, as it turns out, it's not the extra weight you're carrying. It's because you are obese, because your gut is quite leaky, and it's that leakiness that's going to increase your risk for other disease. It's the molecular connection. Leaky gut is a molecular connection between obesity and other chronic diseases, right? Because it means if you're obese, your leakiness is dramatically higher than someone that's the same age that's lean, right? It's the inflammation is much higher. Now, on top of that, stored fat also is a pro-inflammatory system, right? So it puts out, your fat cells actually put out even more inflammation. So now you've got a double whammy, but it's the leakiness in the gut that's a root cause of why obesity drives other disease risks as well, right? Your leakiness started first, that made you obese, and then now that leakiness will continue to progress to other conditions. So you do have to resolve it, right? Weight loss shouldn't be for vanity purposes. I understand that's typically the motivation, and and I get that as much as anybody else. And I mean, I'm going to be in the Caribbean islands in December, January. I'm going to Turks and Caicos, right?
Amazing.
And so I'm thinking myself, I'm like, wait a minute, I have to be there with my shirt off in a bathing suit, right? I am conscious of the way I look and I want to look well. So I understand the vanity part of it, right? And it's perfectly fine. But the reason why it's important to keep that in mind is you want to fundamentally improve your metabolic health and look healthier than doing any sort of sensational weight loss thing, right? So weight loss and being metabolically healthy does not mean you have to have a six-pack. It does not mean you have to be shredded and be able to be an Instagram model, right? That's not a picture of health necessarily. Right.
If whatever crash diet you do, or whatever way you do it, it might not actually fix the leaky gut, and so you end up straight back where you were, which is why people yo-yo diet. I get
exactly,
it.
Yeah, that's exactly why there's rebound effect, right? That's exactly why you yo-yo up and down.
Yes, you
have to reprogram it. So it goes back. Yeah, it goes back to my paper I wrote. It's about metabolically reprogramming your body to respond differently to food. When you do that, when you do the reprogramming, and then you adjust your lifestyle by modulating diet, increasing activity and all that, you'll see permanent weight loss that becomes resilient to gain, right?
Well, how do we do it?
All right, so how do you do it?
Yeah.
So going back to what we did in the clinical trial, I would start with a prebiotic and a probiotic, right? So use the spore-based probiotic because we've been able to show that that can modulate the microbiome in a pro-lean manner, meaning it can increase diversity. It stops the leakiness of the gut. The first study we ever published was a leaky gut study. And it increases the growth of these keystone species that rebuild that mucosal layer. Right. So we use Megaspore Biotic, which is the probiotic that we created back in 2012 and became the #1 selling probiotic in the clinical space with practitioners. So we use that, and then we use the prebiotic. We have Microbiome Labs has a prebiotic called Mega Pre, which is an oligosaccharide-based prebiotic, which feeds bifidobacteria and increases short-chain fatty acid production.
Can I just ask, are we able to use food as a replacement? So for example, just say we're ordering it and it's taking its time in the post. Can you have like fermented foods? Can you have prebiotic vegetables and those things? Will that be just as effective? Or
there aren't any fermented foods that have been shown to have the same effect as a probiotic side of it, right? That doesn't mean don't consume fermented foods. Absolutely still do if it agrees with your system. So it'll be hard to replace the probiotic with food because it's a very specific strain that has very specific genetic function and capability. But the prebiotic, you absolutely can, right? So the prebiotics that we use in there are extracts that are fructo-oligosaccharides. The main ones come from kiwi. Right. So if you're eating kiwis and eating whole kiwis, that's fantastic. You'll get some of those. The other one comes from the inner part of the corn cob, but you can get a similar one out of sweet potatoes or potatoes that are cooked and cooled for 2 or 3 cycles. So you increase the resistant starch in them. And then the third one is a galacto-oligosaccharide, which comes from milk. Right, so you can ferment the milk as well, but the fermentation will reduce the oligosaccharides to a certain degree because the fermentive microbes will eat up the milk. But you can do full fat dairy that's minimally pasteurized and so on, and that'll give you some of the same oligosaccharides as well. But any kind of fiber will be beneficial in this challenge, right? So if you're eating any soluble, insoluble fiber, resistant starch, and oligosaccharides, if you just look at foods that are high in those, you will absolutely be helping your reprogramming of your metabolism. The other category of foods that will become really important for reprogramming and metabolism are polyphenols, right? So you want to research foods that are high in polyphenols, especially in the berry category. Right? So blackberries, blueberries, cherries, and so on. Now, the reason these polyphenols are so important is because they feed a specific organism called Akkermansia muciniphila, and Akkermansia muciniphila is inversely correlated with weight, meaning the higher Akkermansia you have, the more metabolically healthy you are and the leaner you are. Akkermansia rebuilds that mucosal layer better than almost any other microbe in your system. And so Akkermansia loves polyphenols, right? So get those colored fruits and vegetables in, especially everything in the berry family, right? Those are the types of polyphenols that Akkermansia really likes. So soluble fibers, insoluble fibers, resistant starches, oligosaccharides, polyphenols, right? If you're getting those 5 things in adequate amounts in your diet, you're really starting to reprogram your metabolism. Now you add to that healthy fats that can help burn and burn more fat and then reduce inflammation, like extra virgin olive oil, for example, omega fatty acids from fish. Those are the types of fats that'll stoke metabolic activity in your system, which are also really great. And it's doing it through reprogramming your metabolism by reprogramming and changing your microbiome, right? So as you're thinking about diet, right, don't necessarily think about calories just yet. Just think about composition of your diet, right? What kind of diet can you consume that actually helps your microbiome? So you want to diversify your diet as much as you can. You want to log how many different types of foods you eat on a daily basis. You want to get to 40 to 50 different foods on a weekly basis, at least 15 to 20 different foods on a daily basis, right? So you want to be able to see that. And you might be adding nuts and roots and tubers and fruits and vegetables and all these different things, different sources of proteins and so on. All of those things help with the diversification of your diet. So step 1, diversify your diet. Step 2, reduce or eliminate, if you can, processed things, right? Because processed things will have antimicrobials, anti-growth, bacteriostatic compounds, all of these things that'll harm your gut microbiome, which will throw you off balance. So if you can reduce those, that's going to be hugely beneficial. Step 3, increase fiber intake and prebiotics. And remember, fiber is soluble fiber, insoluble fiber, oligosaccharides, resistant starches, and then the final thing is add polyphenols as well, right? So that should be the dietary component of what you're doing. Then when you get the probiotic, add the probiotic in, and you'll start to see a change in your metabolism, in your satiety and all that. Don't expect it to be an overnight change. Our study was 12 weeks, and individuals lost about 35% of visceral fat mass in that 12-week period. We saw a measured response in the first 4 weeks, but we saw a bigger jump from 4 to 8 weeks, and then an even bigger jump from 8 to 12 weeks, right? So don't go in 3 weeks being like, oh, I've been eating this kind of diet, I don't feel much different, I don't look much different. You're almost there. You're getting to the point where you're going to start to see the significant movement metabolically. Now, you add to this some walking, throughout the day, a little bit of resistance training. Resistance training is one of the most beneficial things you can do for your gut and for your metabolic health. You don't have to be a gym rat. You don't have to be a bodybuilder. You don't have to be all complicated in your resistance training, right? Just get a pair of dumbbells and do some compound movements. We're talking about just some squats and just, overhead presses and so on. Just some compound movements that involve a few different joints at a time. And then take your muscles to 80 to 90% to failure, or to failure completely. What does that mean? That just means do the movement until you can't do it anymore, right? Don't just go, oh, I'm going to do 3 sets of 10 and just do, and then you get to 10 and you probably could have done 6 more and you just stop because you program yourself to go 3 sets of 10. You're not taking your muscles to failure. Now, what happens when you take your muscles to failure? Your muscles release a set of compounds called myokines. Myokines are a huge variety of compounds, many of which help your gut microbiome. They can, in fact, increase the diversity of your gut microbiome. They can reduce inflammation in the lining of your gut. It can help the rebuilding of the gut microbiome, and it improves your metabolic health and glucose control, right? So there's this give and take reaction, right? We have to make our choices that we know are good for our microbiome, and then our microbiome in turn provides us the functionality and the capacity to be healthy, lean, and full of energy.
So,
right?
Sorry, so you said to take your muscles to failure. What is your definition of failure?
So failure is where you can't do the movement anymore, right?
That's the key. If you get to that point, that's when you target the microbiome. That's when you're making an impact and you're healing your leaky gut.
Yep. And just do a couple sets of that, right? Like this morning, one of the exercises I was doing was just an overhead press, right? So it's just holding the dumbbells like this. And this is a compound movement to a certain degree because it's involving your shoulders, your elbows, you're engaging a few different muscle groups here. And then if you add a little squat to it, right, and you squat up, you're engaging big muscles in your lower half of your body as well. So I just do that. I know in my mind I can do about 12 of them with the weight that I'm holding, but that's not going to be my stopping point because I'm going to go till I'm like, can't move anymore, right? Your muscles in failure. You drop the weight, you rest 2 minutes, and then you do it again, right? You do about 3 sets of that, and you've taken your muscles to where you need to take them, where you're getting all of that benefit. And it's helping your gut. And then after that, what I did is I went to my kitchen and I made a smoothie that had some protein and fiber in it, right? And some fruits in it so I can get some vitamins, some polyphenols and all that. Now my microbiome is hungry. It's looking for stuff. My myokines are being released and I want to feed my microbiome something that it likes, which are polyphenols and fiber. I put the protein in there to help with the muscle rebuild and to, substitute the amino acids that are going to be needed to rebuild the muscle. But that's just a normal thing. The whole thing took me like, it was like a 20-minute workout, and then it took me 5 minutes to make my smoothie before joining up with you. And you do that 3-4 times a week, something like that, and you're doing perfectly fine, right? You're going to have foundational changes to your metabolic system that's going to be sustainable, right? And I find that since I've been doing that, and I lean down, and I have a healthy metabolism and healthy microbiome. I do blood work and all that all the time to check all these things. I can be resilient. I just went 2 weeks with a lot of traveling and I was not eating great because you're traveling. I got, I think, one workout in the last 2 weeks and I didn't put on any weight. I didn't get softer. I didn't get weaker. I'm fine. My system is resilient, right? If I did that for 2 months, probably we'll start to see some changes. But I can bounce right back into it. And then this week and next week, I'll be back into my routine, right? So you'll be able to do that because you're making a foundational change. Yes. If you're crash dieting and you're losing weight, and then you go off that crash diet for 2 weeks, I guarantee you'll put on 8 to 10 pounds of weight back on.
And this is another reason why, if you're trying to lose weight, cardio is not going to be effective, and it's not going to be as effective as lifting those weights, taking your weight, taking your workout to failure, healing your diet, healing your gut, from the absolute core. I just think it makes total sense. I'm just really, I love this. This is really, really good. What are the top 3 foods that we should avoid? Like, if we're trying to heal our leaky gut, what should we absolutely not touch?
Okay. I would avoid anything with really high saturated fats. So studies have shown that saturated fat increases the leakiness of the gut, right? If your gut is already leaky. If you have a healthy gut, then fine. You can consume saturated fats, which means that, animal products that have high in saturated fat. So fish all day long, chicken all day long, turkey all day long, but beef, maybe you want to reduce the beef, or at least fatty beef, right?
Okay.
To a certain
gut's already leaky.
Your gut's already leaky, so it won't handle it as well.
Okay.
But in that same vein, coconut oil. A lot of people become obsessed with coconut oil because it's a health food, but coconut oil would dramatically drive leaky gut in those with a dysfunctional gut microbiome. And there's some good studies on this, right? So you want to be careful. A lot of people are not accustomed to managing coconut and its very interesting variety of fats. So don't overconsume that, right? So be careful on overconsume it. People cook with it, put it in everything, add it to the smoothies, take tablespoons of it in the morning and so on. If your gut is leaky, that can make it worse, right? So that's one of the things you want to avoid. The other thing is sugar, of course. This goes without saying, but to put it in a microbiome context, when your gut is leaky, it means your balance of microbes is off already, right? That is the perfect opportunity for something like yeast to overgrow in your system, or fungus to overgrow. So you could have things like candida that are overgrowing in your system. You will select for those yeast or fungus by feeding sugar into the system, right? So then not only do you have a bacterial imbalance, now you're allowing opportunistic yeast or mold to overgrow as well, which will create a whole new ways of creating havoc in your system, right? So you don't want to do that, right? So you don't want the the high saturated fat intake. You don't want the sugar intake in there as well. And then the other thing is you want to avoid certain types of sweeteners. A lot of sweeteners are okay. Like to me, stevia, monk fruit, I'm okay with those. Most sugar alcohols are okay, like erythritol, and so on. But sucralose is one that's very questionable, right? There's good data showing that it has a negative effect on your microbiome and your metabolic health. So you don't have to consume it. It's probably better not to. Right. And so avoid that. It doesn't mean that, you can't consume stevia or monk fruit. Those seem to be okay. There isn't much data that shows that they're not beneficial for the microbiome. In fact, there's some data that shows that they could be supportive. But as you're trying to heal your gut, I would stay away from those as well. And then, the last category, I think, did you ask 4 or 5? Or?
3.
Oh, you asked,
but you can finish with the last one.
Okay. The last one is just, and we've said this before, is the processed foods, right? Just know that anything that can last on a shelf for a year is gonna do that by having an adequate amount of antimicrobials in it. Right. So, and I worked in the food safety space as a microbiologist for a long time, trying to consult with companies to reduce the use of antimicrobials and control beneficial bacterial growth or dysfunctional bacterial growth. And I can tell you that if it's packaged and it's dry and it's sitting in the shelf and it can sit in the shelf for a year, it's got adequate amounts of antimicrobials in it, typically 2-3% of the total compound of the total food is some sort of antimicrobial bacteriostatic. When you consume that, that will further damage your microbiome, right? So if your gut is already leaky, you're not doing it any favors by consuming foods that have embedded within them antimicrobials, right? It's just not going to be good for your system. So eat real foods that can spoil. Anything that you allow to sit out there for 2-3 days and it becomes rotten, that's a good sign, right? You can buy some McDonald's, the people that have done this, and leave it on the counter for a year and it looks exactly the same, right? You can look this up and there's real-time accelerated now videos. It's absolutely mind-boggling, right? That is the kind of stuff that can be devastating to your microbiome as you consume it every single day. Now, on top of that, of course, processed things will have pesticides, herbicides, and all that on them, which is a double whammy for your microbiome. So those things, if you can avoid those, go to real foods, diversified. You don't have to be a raw vegan or any of that stuff. That's taking it actually overboard, right? Just eat real food. And try to eat local as much as you can, and then diversify your diet, and you'll be in good shape.
Brilliant. Do you know what? I'm sure that anyone who's listening has learned so much. I've picked up so many gems from you. It's been such a great conversation. How can people buy your supplements? How do they follow you?
Yeah. So, reach out to me on Instagram, Kiran Biome. I think you'll know that I try to be as responsive as I can on there. I get a lot of messages, but part of my goal is just to engage with people and provide them value as much as I can. So reach out on Instagram and Facebook as well, under Kiran Krishnan. And then I'll be posting a lot of educational things, talks, research, all of that stuff on both of those platforms quite a bit. The company I founded, Microbiome Labs, I actually officially left. We sold the business in 2021 to a large Danish biotech company who's phenomenal with a huge microbiome focus. They're the largest enzyme manufacturer in the world, and soon they'll be acquiring the largest probiotic company in the world. So it'll become the biggest gut health probiotic company there is. So I'm very excited that our company brand technology is all within that landscape. And so you can reach out to Microbiome Labs. If you're a patient, you can look for a practitioner on there. If you're a practitioner, you can sign up for a wholesale account and start utilizing the products. And you can find the products actually on Amazon through the Microbiome Labs store as well. On the store, it's normally sold through a seller called Fortress Brands. So that's how you know it's the actual Microbiome Labs stuff. I know a lot of people become a little wary of what's on Amazon. So you have access to those products there. The Megaspore Biotic is the one with the leaky gut studies, and then the Megaspore and the Mega Pre are the ones with the leaky gut and the metabolic health study.
Amazing. Kiran, I couldn't be more thankful to have this conversation with you. And I just want to say it's been fabulous. And I know that my listeners have gotten so much from it. So I just want to say a huge thank you. And yeah, it's been absolutely brilliant.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. We'll do it again if you want to. So just, you know how to reach me. But there's so much to talk about, right? So, and I'm excited. And for people that listen to this and enact any of the behaviors that we talk about, let us know, reach out and let us know how you're doing. If you're losing weight, if you're becoming stronger, if you're becoming leaner, whatever the result may be, or if nothing happened, let us know, right? Like I feed off of that kind of feedback because it also provides me more clues as to the things I should be looking into from a research, education, scientific standpoint as well. So your feedback and data and information is very valuable.